She hadn't spoken in 12 years, until the mountain cowboy said her real name. The axe handle was cracked along the grain where I'd dropped it the winter before, and I'd wrapped it with rawhide and kept using it because that's what you do up here. You fix what you have. You don't ride 2 days down the mountain for a new axe handle when the rawhide holds. I was splitting fence posts on the morning I first noticed her. Not the first morning she was there, mind you. She'd been on Holly's Garner's place for a couple of weeks already, I later found out. But I hadn't paid it much attention. I had 40 head of cattle coming down from the north pasture before the snow hit, and I had a fence that needed 4 new posts, and I had 3 loose boards on the barn's east wall that were letting in wind that would freeze a water trough solid by February. I didn't have time for noticing new people on the neighboring ranch. She was standing at the fence line, not doing anything, just standing there with her hands at her sides, looking out at where my land dropped off into the long canyon below. It was early, the light still blue and cold, and she had a brown wool coat on that was too big for her and a dark braid down her back, and she didn't move when I looked over. Most people, when they realize someone's watching, they shift. They acknowledge it. She just stood there like she'd been there since before I arrived. I went back to splitting posts. That was the fall of 1882. I was 51 years old, and I'd been on that mountain since I was 24, when my father and I drove 200 head of longhorns up from the Texas breaks and built the first real structure, a 3-room log house that still stood and had since grown to 5 rooms and a root cellar and a smokehouse out back. My father died 8 years after we built it, a fast sickness in the spring, and my mother had gone back down to her sister's place in Abilene, and I'd stayed on alone and kept building and kept running cattle, and that was that. 27 years alone on that mountain. I'm not saying that as a complaint. I had hands that came up seasonally, 2 brothers named Birch and Elmore Pickett who'd worked for me 11 years running, and a Mexican man named Jesus Fuentes who was better with horses than any man I'd ever known. They came in March, and they left in November, and I paid them fair, and they worked hard, and I didn't need much more than that. I'm saying it to say that by the time I was 51, I had settled into the particular quiet that comes from living alone long enough. It's not loneliness. Loneliness is wanting something you don't have. This was different. This was more like you forget the shape of what you used to want, and after a while you stop being able to picture it. My wife Clara had died in the winter of 1874. 9 years after we were married, 8 years after we came up the mountain together. Fever, same as my father. Fast. 3 days and she was gone, and I had a 5-year-old girl named Ruth and a 7-year-old boy named Thomas, and I had 40 cattle to winter and a broken pipe fitting in the cistern, and I didn't have time to fall apart. Thomas went to work alongside me soon as he was big enough to pull his weight. He was a quiet boy, serious, more like me than his mother. Ruth was like Clara in her face and in the way she laughed. She laughed easy and often, and it was a hard thing sometimes, looking at her, because it was like looking at what was gone. They grew up. Thomas took a wife in Laramie and bought land in the valley below, and I see him twice a year, sometimes 3 times. Ruth, well, Ruth is what I'll come to, but not yet. I'm telling you about that fence line first, and about the woman in the brown wool coat. Her name, as far as anyone in the valley knew, was Mrs. Aldrich. She'd come to Holly's Garner's place on a mail arrangement. Holly's was a widower himself, ran a respectable cattle and hay operation, and he'd sent word through a broker in Denver for a woman who could cook and keep a house, and he'd offered marriage and a decent life. She'd arrived on the stage in late September. That was what I knew. What I didn't know, what nobody seemed to know, was where she'd come from or who she was before, and nobody was talking about it because the particular fact about Mrs. Aldrich that people did know was that she didn't talk. Not at all, not a word. She'd nod or shake her head. She'd hand you a note if something needed writing down. She'd smile sometimes, though it never reached her eyes all the way, and she'd do whatever work was put in front of her without complaint, but she didn't speak. Holly's Garner had figured this out about 3 days after she arrived. He was a decent man, I'll say that about him. He didn't send her back. He put her in the spare room and gave her work around the house, and he left her alone. But by October, it was clear that whatever arrangement he'd had in mind wasn't going to work the way he'd hoped, and he was at a loss for what to do with her. I didn't know any of this in that first week. I just knew there was a woman at the fence line some mornings, staring into the canyon. The 3rd time I noticed her, I walked over. She heard me coming. The ground was frozen and my boots were loud, and she turned and watched me cross the distance between us. She had brown eyes, darker than I expected from the distance, and a face that had been pretty once and still was, but with something heavy in it. She looked at me steady, the way you look at someone when you've been looked at with pity often enough that you've stopped flinching, and just wait to see what kind of look this one is going to be. I said, "Morning." She didn't say anything. I said, "You're staying with Holly's." She nodded. "Canyon something this time of year," I said, turning to look at what she'd been looking at. "When the aspens are done and everything's gone bare, you can see the whole bottom, see the river from here if the air's right." I wasn't looking for a conversation. I just felt something about the way she was standing there that made me not want to leave without saying something human. I can't explain it better than that. I looked back at her. She turned back to the canyon. I said, "I'm Calhoun. Holt Calhoun. My land runs from the tree line there to the south ridge." I pointed. "You need anything up here, you come over." She turned her head and looked at me again. That look, steady, tired, waiting, and then just the smallest nod. I walked back to my fence posts. It was another week before I heard, through Elmore Pickett, who heard it from the storekeeper in Alderton, about the not speaking. About how she'd been that way when she arrived, and how Hollies didn't know what to do with her, and how people in town weren't sure what to make of it. Some said she was simple. Some said she was crazy. Some said she was hiding something. I thought about the way she'd looked at the canyon. Whatever she wasn't simple. November came in hard. Snow on the 4th of the month, which was 2 weeks early and a foot and a half, and the temperature dropped and stayed down. I was up to my elbows in work, the cattle, the barn, getting the rest of the fence patched before the ground froze too hard to drive posts. Elmore and Birch had gone back down the mountain in October. Jessus had stayed an extra 3 weeks helping me winter the horses, and then he'd gone too. I was alone, and the work was full. Somewhere in the second week of November, I came around the side of the barn and found her in my yard. She was standing by the water trough with a bucket. She'd walked the half-mile from Hollies' place in the snow, and she was standing there like she was waiting to be told what to do. She had better boots on than the first time I'd seen her. She had a scarf wound around her neck, and her braid was pinned up under a wool hat. I said, "Mrs. Aldrich." She looked at me and held up the bucket. I said, "You want to work?" She nodded once. I stood there a minute. I didn't know what Hollies had told her or what she'd decided on her own or why she'd walked half a mile through a foot of snow to stand in my yard with a bucket. But she was there, and there was work, and she looked like a person who needed work more than she needed money. So I showed her the cistern pump, and I showed her where the grain was stored, and I went back to what I was doing. She stayed 6 hours. She fed the horses. She brought in wood without being asked. She worked without stopping and without direction. And when the lights started going, she set the bucket down and walked back toward Hollies' place through the snow. She came back the next morning. I paid her. She didn't object. She didn't thank me. She just took the coins and put them in her coat pocket and went to the water trough. This went on for 2 weeks. In that time, I learned things about her the way you learn things about a person who doesn't talk, from how they work, from what they reach for, from the choices they make when nobody's watching. She was not afraid of cold or mud or blood. When I slaughtered the last of the late-season steers, she helped with the hanging and the gutting without looking away. She knew horses. Not like Jessus knew them, not that particular gift, but she knew the basics. She knew not to come at a horse's hindquarters without speaking first. She knew to watch the ears. Someone had taught her once. She was careful with things. She didn't waste water or grain. She stacked wood like someone who'd stacked a lot of wood. She had that particular economy of motion that comes from hard years, from the kind of life where wasted effort costs you. I found myself watching her sometimes. Not the way a man watches a woman, or not only that. More like she was a puzzle, and I don't mean that unkindly. I mean there was a shape to her that I couldn't quite understand. She was present and absent at the same time. She did the work, and she did it well, and she was there, physically, but there was something that wasn't quite all the way in her body. Like she was doing it from a distance. I didn't ask her anything personal. It wasn't my place. She hadn't invited it, and I hadn't earned it, and some things you just leave alone. It was in the 3rd week that she was at my place when Hollies Garner came up the road. He rode up around noon, and he tied his horse, and he came to the barn where I was working on a bridle, and he took his hat off, and he said, "Holt, I need to talk to you about Vera." Vera? That was her name. I hadn't known that. I don't know why it struck me the way it did, just her name, a regular name, 3 letters, but it landed somewhere. Holly's was a plain-spoken man, and he didn't draw it out. He said the arrangement wasn't working, not because of the not talking, he'd made peace with that, but because of Ruth. My Ruth. She'd come up the mountain 3 days before to bring me a jar of her mother-in-law's apple preserves and to check on me the way she always did in the first hard snow, and she'd met Vera here at my place, and apparently they'd sat together in my kitchen for 2 hours. Ruth had talked. Vera had listened. And Ruth had come home and told her husband that the woman at her father's place was the most remarkable woman she'd ever sat with, quiet or not, and she'd like to bring her down to the valley to stay with them for the winter. Holly said he thought it was a good idea. He said he felt he'd done right by her, but that he wasn't able to give her what she needed, and maybe Ruth's place was a better fit, and he was asking if I knew anything that would inform the decision. I said I didn't know much. I said she was a good worker and she wasn't afraid of hard things, and she seemed, and I had to think about the word, she seemed like a person who was somewhere other than where she was. Holly's nodded like that matched what he knew. He left, I went back to the bridal. Vera came in from the yard, and she stood in the barn doorway, and she looked at me, and I could see that she'd seen Holly's ride up and had probably understood or guessed what it meant. I said that was Holly's. She just stood there. I said, he thinks you might do better down in the valley at my daughter Ruth's place. She's got a good house, a good man, 2 little ones. She'd give you work and she'd give you room and she'd let you be what you are. Something shifted in her face. I couldn't tell you what it was exactly, not relief and not fear and not grief. Something that was all 3 at once, briefly. I said, it's your choice. Holly's isn't pushing you out, he's offering. Ruth wants it, but it's yours. She looked at me for a long time. Then she walked back out into the yard. I sat with the bridle in my hands and the barn quiet around me, and I thought about the fact that she'd been here every day for 3 weeks, and that when she left for Ruth's it would be a while before I saw her again, maybe not until spring, and something in me that I hadn't noticed had been waking up, something I hadn't felt in a long time, noticed that absence before it was even there. I didn't say anything about it. I was 51 years old and I'd been alone for a long time, and I knew how to keep things inside where they wouldn't make trouble. She went down to Ruth's at the end of November. The winter was a hard one. I had a heifer die in December, got stuck in a drift and froze before I found her, and I had a water pipe freeze and split, and I spent 2 days thawing and replacing it, working alone in weather that kept trying to push me back inside. My hands that year were bad. I had a joint problem in my right hand that I'd been managing for 2 years, and the cold made it worse, and some mornings I had to soak it in warm water for 20 minutes before I could grip anything properly. I'm telling you this not to complain. I'm telling you this because it was that winter, alone in those months, that I first started to understand that something had changed. The quiet that I'd lived in for so long, the kind of quiet that wasn't loneliness, had a different quality to it. Not miserable, but different. Like when you've had a fire going in a room for a while, and then it goes out, and the room isn't cold yet, but you know the cold is coming. Ruth wrote me a letter in January. She had good penmanship, Clara's penmanship, and her letters were always full and warm, and she told me everything about the house and the children and her husband Garland's plans for the spring, and at the end she wrote, Vera is well. She is good with the children. She does not speak, of course, but you know this, and the children have decided it is just how she is, which I think is the right way to see it. She smiled yesterday when Nathaniel fell asleep in the barn with the cat on his chest. I think, Papa, she has been somewhere else for a long time, and she is perhaps beginning to come back a little. She asked after you. She wrote it on her slate, how is your father? I told her you were the same as always, which is to say impossible and fine. I read that letter twice, maybe 3 times. In February, I rode down the mountain on a clear day to bring Ruth a haunch of venison and some dried apples from the cellar, and to see the grandchildren, and also, though I didn't say this to myself in exactly that way, to see Vera. She was in the kitchen when I came in. She heard me and turned, and something in her face, I don't know, I don't have better words for it than this, she was glad to see me. Genuinely glad, the way you're glad when something you hadn't let yourself expect turns up anyway. I took off my hat and I said, how are you getting on? She picked up her slate off the sideboard. She'd carried one I'd learned since she stopped speaking, a small writing slate, the kind schoolchildren used. She wrote on it and turned it toward me. It said, "Good, better than I thought." I said, "Ruth treating you right." She erased it with her sleeve and wrote, "She is very like you." I said, "That's a warning or a compliment depending on the day." She smiled, and it was different from the smiles I'd seen in November. It reached her eyes this time, just barely, but it did. I stayed for supper, sat across from her at Ruth's table and ate venison stew, and listened to Nathaniel, who was 6, tell me about a fox he'd been tracking in the snow with elaborate detail and no conclusion. And I watched Vera across the table watching Nathaniel with that smile that reached her eyes. And I thought that whatever she'd been, wherever she'd been, Ruth was right, she was coming back a little. I rode back up the mountain that night. The cold was sharp and the stars were hard and bright, and I rode and I didn't think about much, which was usual. But somewhere up in the high timber in the dark, I found myself thinking about her face when I'd come in. The way she'd turned from the stove and the look she'd had. I hadn't made a woman look at me that way in a long time. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was 51 and she was younger, certainly, though I didn't know how much, and that she was broken in some way I didn't understand, and that it wasn't my place and it wasn't my business and I should go home and sleep, and in the morning get back to the cattle. That was what I told myself. She came back up the mountain in late March when the roads were passable, not to Holly's place, to mine. I want to be honest about how that happened, because it matters. Ruth had written me a second letter in February, I'll say that straight out, and in that letter she'd said some things that I'm fairly sure she was saying with a purpose, because Ruth is more like Clara than she is like me, and Clara had a gift for planting things and waiting to see what grew. Ruth said that Vera was a help and a pleasure to have around and that she was welcome to stay as long as she needed. And then she said, "She talks about you, Papa, by which I mean she writes about you. She asks if we've heard from you. She tells me things about how you work, little details she noticed when she was up there. She notices things. I think she notices things about you in particular." And then she said, "I am not telling you anything. I am only saying what I observe." That was what Ruth wrote. So when Vera came up the mountain in March and appeared in my yard again with her boots and her braid and her slate, I won't pretend I was entirely surprised. But I won't pretend I'd been expecting it either, because expecting it would have required a kind of hope I hadn't let myself have. She wrote on the slate, "Do you still need help?" I said, "I always need help." She put the slate in her coat pocket and went to the barn. Spring is its own kind of hard on a mountain ranch. The snow goes soft and the mud comes, and the cattle need moving and the pastures need checking, and there are always fences that didn't survive the winter, and always one thing that broke that you didn't know about until it matters. Vera worked through all of it. She knew more than I'd given her credit for in November. She'd grown up on a ranch somewhere, I'd come to believe, though she'd never told me so. She knew how to read a heifer that was about to calve. She knew how to pull a stuck calf, and she'd done it before. She knew which kind of mud was load-bearing and which kind would take a horse's leg. We worked side by side for 3 weeks before I asked her anything personal, and even then it came out sideways, not as a question exactly. I said, "You know this kind of work." She had the slate out and she wrote, "Yes, a long time ago." I said, "You grew up on a ranch." She erased, wrote, "My father's." I said, "What happened to it?" She held the slate and looked at it for a moment, and then she erased and didn't write anything. I said, "Never mind." She wrote, "He died. Then there were men I trusted who I shouldn't have." I looked at her. She was looking at the ground. I said, "That's enough." She erased again. We went back to work. But that night I sat with it. In the kitchen, with the lamp turned low and a cup of coffee I wasn't really drinking, I sat with what she'd written and I thought about what it would take to put a person somewhere so far inside themselves that they stop speaking. Not injury, not birth, something that happened to them. Something they'd carried for 12 years, because that's what I'd been told, that she hadn't spoken in 12 years, alone with whatever it was. I thought about the 12 years I'd run this place alone after Clara died. Not the same thing. But I understood the shape of it. I thought, the way you close a room down and stop going in, because going in hurts and there's nothing in there that will give you anything back. I went to bed and I didn't sleep well. The thing about being around a person who doesn't speak is that you start to hear differently. I'd lived alone so long that my own silence was familiar to me, but this was a different kind. Her silence was full of things. She had a way of looking at something that told you what she thought of it. She had a way of going still when something was wrong and a way of going light-footed when something pleased her. When one of the mares, a gray-eyed had 7 years, nuzzled her shoulder the first week of May, and she stood still under it with her eyes closed and her hand on the horse's neck. I was 50 feet away, and I saw it, and I thought, there she is. That's who she is under all of it. I said her name that evening. Not her last name. I'd always used Mrs. Aldrich, everyone had, and it was the wrong name anyway. It was Holly's name, a name from an arrangement that hadn't worked out, not her real name. I didn't know her real name, but something about the afternoon and the gray mare and the closed eyes made me think of what Holly's had said. Vera. I said it, I said it. She was at the pump and she turned and looked at me, and something happened in her face that I hadn't seen before. Not the gladness from February, not the steady watching look from November. Something that went deeper than either of those. Something that cracked open a little. I said, I'm sorry if I just thought it was your name, your real name. She stood there for a long time. Then she wrote on the slate, no one has said that name in 12 years. I looked at it, I said, is it a hard thing hearing it? She looked at the words she'd written, and then she looked at me and she shook her head. I said, good. I went inside and I stood at the kitchen window, and I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in so long that it took me a minute to recognize it. Not grief. Not longing exactly, something older and simpler than either one. I thought, I am not going to make a fool of myself. I am 51 years old and I have 27 years of this mountain, and I am not going to make a fool of myself over a woman who has her own wounds to carry and her own reasons for being where she is. I thought that, and then I thought about saying her name and the way her face had gone. She found me on the east slope the second week of May. I'd been out checking fence all morning, and I'd started back toward the barn, and on the way I'd taken a bad step on a rock that was loose in the thaw mud, and gone down hard on my right knee and my right hand both. And the hand, the bad joint, the one that had been bad for 2 years, had bent wrong. And when I pushed myself up, it was on fire from the wrist to the knuckle, and I'd sat down on a rock and tried to breathe through it. I wasn't in danger. I wasn't injured serious. But I was sitting on a rock on a hillside and May holding my right hand against my chest, and my eyes were closed against the pain, and I was not, in that moment, doing well. I heard her coming through the grass, and I opened my eyes. She stopped when she saw me, looked at the hand. She didn't ask and she didn't hover. She went to one knee in front of me, and she took my right hand in both of hers very carefully, and she turned it to look at the joint. I said, it's an old thing, I'm all right. She didn't let go. She pressed her thumbs along either side of the joint, gentle but deliberate, and she looked up at me and waited. I said, some kind of swelling in the joint. 2 years, cold makes it worse. She nodded. She held my hand for another minute, and then she stood up and she held out her other hand to help me up. I took it. She was not a small woman, but she was smaller than me, and she braced and pulled, and I stood. She didn't let go right away. She held my hand, the bad one, until I found my footing on the slope. Then she let go, and she took the slate out of her coat. She wrote, you should not be working this alone. I said, I've been working it alone for 27 years. She erased and wrote, I know. Then she erased again and wrote something and looked at it for a moment like she was deciding whether to show it to me, and then she turned the slate around. It said I would like to stay. I stood on that hillside in the May mud with the sun at the wrong angle and my bad hand against my chest, and I looked at what she'd written. I said, stay. She nodded. I said, you know what you're saying. She nodded again. I said, this is hard work and there's not much about it that gets easier as the years go on, and I am not a young man and I am not an easy one either. I never was. I know my own flaws. She took the slate back and erased what was on it, and she wrote for a moment, and then she turned it toward me. It said, I know what I'm saying. And then underneath that, in smaller letters, I've been watching you since November. I stood there for a while. I said, all right then. I want to tell you what the next 2 months were. They were the working months, the good months on a mountain ranch, when the weather is with you and the pasture is green and the cattle are fat and moving. We worked together from first light to last, and I can tell you honestly that she was the better half of that work. Not in raw strength, I still had that on her, though less and less as the hand got worse, but in the 10,000 small ways that matter more than strength. She saw things I missed. She anticipated things. She was there at the cistern before I thought of it. She had the horses grained before I got to the barn. And she was quiet, but it was a different quiet than before. It was a comfortable quiet. The kind two people have when they don't need words to fill in what they already know. I did not press her to speak. I did not try to fix her or change her or get her back to wherever she'd been before. That wasn't what she needed from me, and it wasn't what I wanted to give. What I wanted to give, what I could give, was the work and the mountain and the steady days and someone who would say her name. I said her name every day. Vera in the morning and Vera in the evening, and sometimes in the middle of something just because. Just because it was her name, and I wanted her to hear it. I don't know exactly when I understood that I was in love with her. I don't think it happened in a single moment. I think it was incremental, like most true things, like a wall you build one stone at a time, and one day you stand back and there it is, solid and there, and you can't quite point to the moment it became a wall. I know I understood it fully in June, on a Thursday. We'd been moving cattle to the upper pasture and we'd pushed hard all morning, and in the afternoon we stopped at the spring to water the horses, and we were both tired and dirty, and she sat down on a flat rock and tipped her head back to the sun. Just that. Just her face up to the sun with her eyes closed, worn out from good work, and her boots muddy and her hands brown from the sun. I sat down on a rock 10 feet from her and I watched her and I thought, I love this woman. I thought it plainly and simply and without confusion. I thought, I am going to have to tell her. I told her in July. It was a Sunday, the one day I kept anything like a rest day, the necessary chores and nothing more. And she had made coffee, and we were sitting outside on the 2 wooden chairs I kept by the front door in the summer months, and the valley was laid out below us, and the aspens were full green and everything was still. I said, I have something to say, and I want you to let me say all of it before you write anything. She looked at me. I said, I'm 51 years old and I have this land and this house, and whatever years I've got left. I'm not easy to live with, I know that. I am set in my ways and I work too much, and I don't always remember to say the things a person ought to say. I've been alone a long time, and some of what that does to a person doesn't come undone easy. You know all that already because you've been here 3 months and you've seen it. I said, but I want you here, not as hired help. I want you here in the permanent sense if you'll have it. If that's not what you want or not what you need, you say so and nothing changes between us. You can stay through the season and I'll think no less of you. But I'm going to tell you what's true and then leave it to you. I said, I love you, Vera. I didn't expect to, and I don't have a long speech about it. I just do. And if you wanted to build something with me here, that's what I'm asking. If you don't, I understand that too. She was looking out at the valley. She sat still for a long time after I stopped talking. I waited. I was good at waiting. Then she picked up the slate and she wrote, and she held it toward me. It said, no one has ever said my name the way you say it. I looked at it, I said, how do I say it? She erased and wrote, like it matters. I sat with that for a minute. She erased again and wrote and held the slate up. It said, yes, I will build something with you. I said, all right. She reached over and put her hand on my forearm. She didn't look at me when she did it. She was still looking out at the valley, but she put her hand there and left it there. And the weight of it was real and solid and warm through my shirt. And I covered it with my other hand, and we sat there a while like that, the two of us, looking at the mountain we were going to live on. Now here's the part I don't tell many people. It was August, a Tuesday, hot afternoon, the kind you don't often get at that altitude, and we were in the barn out of the sun doing small work. She was mending a piece of harness, and I was working on a wheel spoke that had cracked, and we'd been quiet for a while the way we were quiet. And then she said my name. It was a simple word, 1 syllable spoken low. But it stopped me cold because it was the first sound I'd heard from her in all those months. Not a note or a cough or a hummed breath, I mean her voice. Her actual voice saying my name. I went completely still. She had gone still too. The harness was in her lap and she was looking at it, and I could see from where I was sitting that she was shaking slightly. Fine tremors in her hands. I didn't say anything for a while. I didn't make a big thing of it. Then I said, that's a good word. She looked up at me and her eyes were bright and I could see her deciding something, pressing through something, and she said it again. Holt. Low, her voice was low and a little rough from 12 years unused. but it was hers, unmistakably hers. I set down the spoke. I crossed the barn and I sat down on the bench beside her, and I didn't say anything and I didn't touch her and I just waited, because that's what she needed, just someone beside her while she found her way back. She said, I didn't know if I still could. I said, you still can. She put her hands over her face for a moment. She wasn't crying. Or she was, but not much and not in a falling apart way, in the way that comes from something releasing, some long tension finally going, like a rope cut. I put my arm around her and she leaned against me. Just that. She leaned against me and we sat in the warm barn in August, and after a while her hands came down from her face and she took a breath. She said there were things that happened. I said, I know. She said, I don't know if I can tell you all of it. I said, you don't have to. She was quiet for a while. I held her. The horses moved in the stalls behind us, and the afternoon light came in slant through the barn door, and there were dust motes in it. She said, my name is Vera Calloway. I haven't said that either, in a long time. I said, Vera Calloway. She made a sound, not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, something that was neither and both. She said, that's how you say it, like it matters. I could tell you the rest of it in pieces. I could tell you about the night in September when she told me, haltingly and with long silences, about the men who'd taken her father's ranch after he died, the legal tricks and the threats, and what it had cost her to fight it, and what it had cost her when she lost, and what the losing had done to the person she'd been before. I could tell you that hearing it made something hard in me that I didn't much like, and that I looked into what could be done about it, and found that the answer was, not much, not now, 12 years on. I could tell you that she accepted that better than I did. I could tell you about the morning in October when I rode down to the county seat in Alderton and came back with a document and put it on the kitchen table in front of her and said, this puts your name on the deed. Joint, you're as much this place as I am. She looked at the document for a long time. She said, you didn't need to do that. I said, I know. She said, why did you? I said, because you've got no ground under your feet that's yours, and you should have ground under your feet that's yours. Everyone should. She reached across the table and she touched my face. Her hand on my jaw just briefly and her eyes on mine, steady and direct and clear, no distance in them, nothing behind glass anymore, all the way there, and she said, Holt Calhoun. I said, Vera Calloway. She almost smiled. She said, Calhoun when we marry. I said, whenever you like. She said, spring, when everything starts again. We married in April in Ruth's yard, with the mountains still holding snow on the peaks and the valley grass coming in green. Ruth cried. Nathaniel asked if the ceremony was going to be long. Garland shook my hand with both of his, which is something Garland only does when he means something. I've been asked over the years what happened, what changed her, what made her speak again. I don't have a simple answer for that, and I'm suspicious of simple answers for complicated things. What I think, and I've thought about it for a long time, is that nothing changed her from the outside. Nothing I did or said unlocked something. What happened was simpler and slower than that. What happened was that I gave her time and work, and I said her name like it mattered, which it did. And after enough time in a place where she was known and needed, and no one was waiting for her to be other than what she was, something in her decided it was safe enough to come back. And when she came back, she pulled me up with her. That's the truth of it, and I know it now even if I didn't then. I was going down too. Not fast, not in any way that was visible from the outside. But slowly, the way a foundation settles over years, almost imperceptibly, until you check it against something straight and you see how far it's moved. I'd been alone so long I'd stopped being sure I was anything much beyond the work. Not self-pity. Just erosion, the long slow wearing away of not being seen. She saw me. Every day she was here, she saw me. And there's something in being truly seen by a person you respect, a person of substance and strength and her own hard history, that you can't get from any other source. Not work, not land, not the satisfaction of cattle fat on good grass. It doesn't replace it. She'd needed someone who would say her name like it mattered. I'd needed someone who could see me at all. We found each other at the right time. Maybe the only time it could have worked for either of us, with the particular wounds we each had at the particular moment we had them. I don't know. I'm not built for that kind of reasoning. I just know what's here. This mountain, this house, the 5 rooms and the root cellar and the smokehouse. And in the kitchen right now a woman named Vera Calhoun, who was Vera Calloway before, and who says my name every day in a voice that still, after all these years, sounds like something coming back from somewhere far away and deciding to stay. The aspens are going again. Late October, the light through them gold and quick, and in the canyon below you can see the river if the air is right. She was standing at the window this morning looking at them. I came up behind her, and she leaned back against me the way she does, and we stood there a while looking at the canyon and the river and the light in the trees. I said her name. She covered my hands with hers. That's all there is. That's the whole of it.